The bottom line reality is that wildlife rangers around Queen Elizabeth Park don't have a good reputation. They're, often in some communities, frankly, seen as enemies. And there's been some efforts, I think, to repair that relationship. But as a general rule, I think people feel that wildlife rangers have a mandate that is to protect wildlife, not for them, but for, sort of foreigners and this kind of ethereal concept of conservation that's not really part of anything that's meant to improve their lives. And the amount of kind of violence and aggressive enforcement that is, I think, generally associated with wildlife rangers has led to a lot of mistrust, a lot of alienation, and a real sense that the purpose of these people is to kind of harass and impose a system that doesn't include us on us.
Welcome to the Mongabay newscast. I'm your co-host, Mike DiGirolamo. Bring you weekly conversations with experts, authors, scientists, and activists working on the front lines of conservation, shining a light on some of the most pressing issues facing our planet and holding people in power to account. This podcast is edited on Gadigal land. Today on the newscast, we speak with Ashoka Mukpo, a staff features writer at Mongabay. He joins me to talk about national parks on the African continent, what their presence means for conservation, and their impact on human rights. The UN Global Biodiversity Framework's 30 by 30 plan requires countries across the world to expand the amount of land they have under some form of conservation protection. In Africa, that would require the inclusion of nearly 1 million square miles. Ashoka traveled to 3 countries in East Africa to look at the current state of conservation in some of these protected areas. Our conversation today focuses on Queen Elizabeth National Park in Uganda, where there have been allegations of extrajudicial killings of suspected bushmeat poachers. Ashoka unpacks this difficult dynamic in modern conservation, where protecting threatened species from poaching is often accompanied by tremendous violence, creating an environment of hostility between park rangers and the people who live around them. Ashoka, welcome to the Mongabay newscast. It's great to have you with us.
It's great to be back.
So you took a reporting trip to East Africa in late 2023. Can you tell our listeners why you took this trip and what it was for?
Well, aside from the fact that as a conservation reporter, it always helps when you're on the ground talking to people who are most impacted by conservation. I'd say the reason that we chose this trip, it has a lot to do with the Global Biodiversity Framework, which is this treaty that was passed or ratified in 2022, if I'm not mistaken, that essentially committed the world to increasing the amount of land that's under conservation protection. And there's been a lot of controversy around this because a lot of people are saying, well, where's this land going to come from? And we thought that a good way to kind of look at the bigger issues related to expanding the amount of conservation land was to look at what's currently happening right now. And we wanted to choose countries that are very biodiverse and have big tourism industries and where there's been a lot of sort of like conflict around what should conservation look like. And obviously Kenya is kind of at the top of that list because in a lot of ways, what we know as conservation in Africa in particular really originated in Kenya and Rwanda and Uganda as well, because those are both countries that are beautiful, full of rare wildlife and, are kind of targeted as important biodiversity hotspots. So I think that's the best answer.
So there's one park in particular, which is called Queen Elizabeth National Park, and it's in Uganda. And you went there. What did you find there?
So, Uganda was the country that we decided to look at government-run national parks. In Kenya, we were looking at kind of community-oriented conservancies, which is a newer model. And in Rwanda, kind of public-private, some people call it privatization by a group called African Parks. But Uganda is a country really where anything that has to do with conservation at this point is almost exclusively under the control of the government. And part of what, we thought would be important with this project would be to kind of look at the history of how conservation emerged in East Africa. And Queen Elizabeth Park, I think, is sort of a really emblematic example. It's right in the name, right? It's in Central Africa, and it's called Queen Elizabeth Park. So, it's like, well, how did you get to a point where a big, national park in Africa is named after a, British monarch? And what does that say about sort of the current state of how conservation exists in this landscape, and, how do people perceive it?
Thanks for tuning in to listen to the first few minutes of this podcast. To hear the full conversation, find the Mongabay newscast wherever you get your podcasts from and click subscribe. You can also get each new episode straight to your inbox by subscribing to Mongabay's weekly newsletter at mongabay.com. And if you really want to support us, you can donate to our Patreon at patreon.com/Mongabay. Thanks for listening.